for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, or IGMAP as we like to refer to it. And before I introduce our guests and talk a little bit about this program, I'd like us to acknowledge that before we start discussing atrocity crimes and impunity, we should acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Oneida and Onondaga peoples. This program today is part of IGMAP's Practitioner in Residence program, which is designed to try and bridge the traditional divides that exist between the worlds of academics and the worlds of practitioners, and to try and have them have more interaction with each other, more dialogue with each other. In this case of this particular visit, this week and this evening's talk, this is also co-sponsored by two other institutes that are doing great work here at Binghamton University, the Human Rights Institute and the Kashik Institute for Social Justice for Women and Girls. So we're excited to have those co-sponsors with us. I'd also like to mention that this evening we are starting a new feature as part of our Practitioner in Residence talk, which is that after the formal presentation and some formal Q&A, we will have some light snacks and an opportunity to mingle and continue the conversation. So if you're not comfortable asking a question in the formal context, you can still ask that one-on-one, or keep talking about the topics that our speaker has raised, and also grab a little something to eat before you head out. So our guest this evening, Andrew Boyle, is an attorney who's working in the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Institute, or the Brennan Center for Justice. He's currently based in Washington, D.C., working on issues related to emergency powers. He's been with us all week, and he's already spoken to half a dozen classes, met with research groups, student associations, individual students, faculty, and administrators. We've kept him pretty busy throughout the week, and he's not done until tomorrow mid-morning. Today, his presentation draws upon about 7 years of experience as a UN prosecutor at the extraordinary chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, or what are commonly referred to as the Khmer Rouge Trials, where he prosecuted senior Khmer Rouge officials for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So I am sure we're all going to learn a great deal tonight. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Boyle.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure and honor to speak with you. Before I get started, I just also want to thank very much Max and Nadia for allowing me to be here as a practitioner in residence. It's been an incredible week. It's not over. In addition to this presentation, some more events tomorrow, but I've really enjoyed the opportunity to speak with different classes, with faculty, with students, and so it's really been a pleasure, and you guys have been nothing but kind and making me feel welcome, so I very much appreciate that. So I want to talk to you a little bit tonight, and some of the classes that I've talked to over the course of the week, I've been talking about my work in atrocity crimes and the prosecution of atrocity crimes. But tonight I wanted to make that a little bit more real about what we're talking about when we are working with evidence to try to bring cases against individuals for perpetrating these crimes. I will say at the outset, there are some images that could be a little bit disturbing here. There's nothing too graphic, but I want to note that at the beginning. So I'd like to talk about what we are trying to look at as prosecutors. What does the evidence look like, and specifically in the Khmer Rouge trials. So a lot of what we are working with is witness statements, witnesses who have observed some of the events that have taken place, and that is done by an investigatory office at the Khmer Rouge trials. If you see here, this one was actually done through telephone interviews, but often they are also done in person at the court. And these types of statements are taken at the investigatory level because the Khmer Rouge trials are based on the civil law system. Investigations are carried out by investigative judges. They have a staff of investigators. The way that the investigative judges interact with the prosecution and the defense is that as evidence is coming in from the investigating judges, I'll say the prosecution kicks off a case by seizing the investigating judges with a case file, saying we have reason to believe that crimes were committed in this area by these individuals. The investigating judges then go out and find evidence of whether crimes were committed in those areas. We as the prosecution and individuals as the defense can then come back and say, we would like you, it seems like the evidence that you're producing and putting on the case file indicates that there might be other crimes in this area, or we'd like you to talk to more witnesses about this issue, but they do not have to agree with us in terms of those requests. They're an independent body. Alternatively, on the back end, if they come across, if we say, please investigate this town for mass graves, if they come back and say, in the course of investigating that town, we also found mass graves in a town nearby, we as the prosecution have the ability to say, yes, we want to include that in the case, or no, we do not want to include that in the case. So investigative statements play a big role in this. These types of statements are also what we are basing our, once we go to trial, once we're past the investigatory stage, what we are basing our witness requests off of. And this is generally the only information we might have about a witness when we go into court. Another aspect that I've talked about in some of the classes this week of the civil law system is that you do not get to have interaction with witnesses as a party before you get into court. The idea of the civil law system is that it's better and witnesses will be more truthful if they have not had interaction with parties. And so we have to use these types of statements as a way to decide what it is we're going to ask them. And then to try to see if they might have other knowledge outside of the four corners of their statements, which can be tricky as a strategic question about if you want to ask them about other things, you don't know what type of answers you're going to get, it could be harmful to your case. Another type of witness statements that we use are, sorry, I don't know if you guys can see. Another type of witness statements that we use are statements taken by other organizations, civil society organizations. If you look on the date of this statement here, this one was created, I think, in 2004. Yeah, date 27 May 2004. That was just as the Khmer Rouge trial court was being set up. This was an interview taken by an organization called the Documentation Center of Cambodia, or DCCAM. DCCAM was set up well before there was actually a Khmer Rouge trial on the scene. It was set up by individuals at Yale University. It still exists today to collect evidence and testimony about what occurred under the Khmer Rouge. But these sorts of statements, while they may not be given the same evidentiary weight in the course of a trial, when I talk about evidentiary weight, we're talking about how much the judges believe what is in a particular document or a piece of evidence. The reason they may not be given as much evidentiary weight is because they are not taken within the judicial process. The prosecution and the defense had no interaction with it. They're not taken by judges. Nevertheless, they were an excellent source of indications when the investigations started up about who the investigators should talk to. And so they would often read these investigative documents taken for research purposes by organizations like DCCAM and decide who they would then interview in a formal sense. Of course, once you get to trial, you have all sorts of in-person testimony. These generally are three types of people. You have witnesses based off the documents that I described before. You have civil parties. Again, in the French legal system, which Cambodia has adopted because it used to be a protectorate of France, the victims become a party to the case, unlike in the United States, where if you are a victim of a crime, you might be a witness, but you wouldn't be a party to the case. Civil parties have to apply to the court to become civil parties. They have to show that they were harmed by the events that are under investigation in that particular case, and then they get to be represented in court by their own attorneys. The only difference between often civil parties, because they are victims, are also eyewitnesses to what occurred at various crime sites. The only difference is that in the French system, civil parties do not have to swear an oath. Because they are found to have the fact that the harm was done to them is why they are allowed to be in court outside of being witnesses. And then experts. We, in the course of the trials that I was prosecuting, one of the experts there on the right, his name is Stephen Heder, were people who had done a lot of research on issues such as the Khmer Rouge, such as genocide, and were able to, once they proved their expertise to the court, were able to opine on issues related to the case, even though they weren't fact witnesses. So these were people who didn't visually see these events taking place, but were able to give an expert analysis of, once they had read documents, of what these documents meant to them. This is a witness here on the left, and so is the, I believe, next slide. And this is what they call a district secretary, Pech Chim. These were both in what we call internal witnesses, witnesses who were members of the Khmer Rouge. And these were often the strongest witnesses that you can get when you are trying to prove policies of the organizations. People who are on the inside receiving commands and instituting those commands and then sending information back up the chain. If you see, the Tram Kak is a district in Cambodia, and he was the district secretary. That was in the hierarchy of the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal itself was set up, you might be able to grab a chair here. The Khmer Rouge itself was set up through a hierarchical level all the way from the top in Phnom Penh down through the various districts of Cambodia. But it was also, the tribunal was set up to try only the senior leaders and those most responsible. One of the challenges that we had when we were trying to bring witnesses in that were themselves members of the Khmer Rouge was explaining to them that we were not trying to prosecute them and trying to get them to therefore give us more information. They were concerned about incriminating themselves, and that worked to a greater or lesser degree. Eventually, we started giving them signed documents from the prosecutors of the UN Tribunal saying that they had no intention to prosecute this individual. That helped put them at ease a little bit. But we would often encounter situations where individuals such as this guy would say, we would ask them about certain events or certain policies, and they would say something to the effect of, I'm aware that this took place, but it didn't happen in my unit. So a way of giving us evidence, but also absolving themselves from those crimes. There were a lot of drawbacks about instituting these trials. The Khmer Rouge court wasn't set up till the early 2000s. The Khmer Rouge ended in 1979. One of the drawbacks of there are a lot of drawbacks to doing cases that long after the fact. People die, memories fade, you lose track of witnesses, you lose documents. One of the benefits of doing it that late is that it gives a lot of other people a lot of time to think about and study and research what happened during the Khmer Rouge. So we were able to rely on books of individuals that had conducted research. Ben Kiernan is professor at Yale University who had done a lot of research, including on original documents regarding the Khmer Rouge, which gave an outline of how the Khmer Rouge operated. Elizabeth Becker, and just as a side note, if anyone is interested in the Khmer Rouge, Elizabeth Becker was a journalist for the Washington Post. This is probably the most accessible an interesting read about the Khmer Rouge that I could recommend to you for just sort of an introductory level understanding of the Khmer Rouge. Elizabeth Becker was a journalist in Cambodia before the Khmer Rouge. I think she left in 1973, and the Khmer Rouge came into power in 75. Interestingly, she was one of 3 Westerners that were invited by the Khmer Rouge as they were starting to try to open up to the world a bit more in 1978 to visit Phnom Penh. She had an audience with Pol Pot at that time, was able to sort of see herself what Cambodia looked like at that time. The Khmer Rouge gave these 3 journalists or 3 individuals a sort of package tour of Cambodia where they brought them to a sort of model collective, which was a place where they had forced people to live together and work together and eat together, where everyone was, of course, happy and smiling, which was not the reality in other parts of the country. We even had some books from the people that we were putting on trial. This is Khieu Samphan. He was the, as he looks more nowadays, not when he was in charge. He was the titular head of state of Cambodia, but that was not where he drew his power from. That was almost a meaningless title for the outside world. Where he drew his power from was that he was part of the governing communist bodies within the country. Your position within the Communist Party mattered much more than your position in the government in what was called Democratic Kampuchea, or the Khmer Rouge. So he is a French-trained economist, has a PhD in economics, and likes to write, as people with PhDs like to do. And had written this book before the tribunal was on the scene. And there were quotes in it like this one, where he says, since the cooperatives had been first organized in 1971, the CPK, which is the Communist Party of Kampuchea, had been able to control rice, control the economy, control the people. And here's where I want to start talking about linkage evidence. Linkage evidence is what we need to be able to prove that the people at the center of government were the ones controlling what was happening all around the country, in different parts of the country. And here we have an indication from one of the people that we're prosecuting that they were in charge, actually had a policy of controlling everything within Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge took control of the economy, took control of the people, eradicated money, eradicated the government, except for themselves. And here you have essentially one example of an acknowledgement in that regard. We also were able to take use of reports made by civil society. These are organizations that are, have an interest in various issues, and that went out and conducted their own investigations and interviewed victims. This report, like Ghost Changes Body, is about the practice of forced marriage in democratic Kampuchea. Forced marriage is one of the crimes that we would prosecute. In these cases, we also prosecuted the forced sexual relations within forced marriages, prosecuted as rape. Forced marriages would often take place in the context of an individual being told in the morning that they were going to be married that afternoon. One of the overriding agendas of the Khmer Rouge was to destroy all other sources of power outside of the revolution in the Communist Party itself. That meant destroying not only organized religion of all types, but also family units. Nevertheless, they had, as part of their sort of radical plan to rapidly industrialize Cambodia, they had to create a giant workforce, because their plan to rapidly industrialize Cambodia was all based around the production of rice. Rice is an incredibly labor-intensive crop in terms of growing and sowing rice. And so you need large numbers of people to do that. The Khmer Rouge plan was to grow from 8 million to 20 million in roughly 5 years. At the same time, their policies, and they were intentionally killing large numbers of people. And so they needed to both have people that were starved, that were weak, producing new laborers at the same time that they were eradicating the family. The way that they did this often was by forcing marriages and forcing sexual relations within those marriages. Not everyone who was married during the Khmer Rouge was forcibly married. Sometimes one partner actually did get to choose. For example, a soldier might be rewarded by saying, "Who would you like to marry?" So the soldier got to choose, but the partner did not. But often both partners would find themselves forced into these situations. In fact, in one of the cases that is still on appeal, we, the prosecution, argued that both the male and the female partner in these forced marriages and forced sexual relations cases were the products of rape, were victims of rape. The trial chamber found that only the women were the victims of rape under the definition of rape at the time that the crimes were committed, and that was our sole appeal ground. We didn't win everything in that case, but that was our sole appeal ground, that in fact the men in these cases were also raped in these situations. So these can provide, these expert reports can also be very helpful. I want to talk now about a chunk of evidence that we obtained from something called the S21 Security Center. As those who have been to Phnom Penh know, the S21 Security Center, which today is known as Tuol Sleng, was a former school in the center of Phnom Penh that was turned into a prison and torture center, and today is a museum. So if you go to Phnom Penh, you can visit this museum, which is sort of a site of conscience now. This is a picture of Tuol Sleng as it was when the Vietnamese entered Cambodia in 1979, when they invaded after they had had enough of Cambodia cross-border attacks and quickly overthrew the much weaker Cambodian forces. You can see barbed wire along the windows there. There will be some more pictures of there. However, so because Vietnam invaded so quickly into Cambodia, they invaded so quickly that they actually outstripped their supply lines. So they had to wait so that they could get more gas for their tanks before they proceeded into Phnom Penh. But they invaded so quickly that the operators of S21 didn't have time to destroy the relevant documents that were there, and they kept a lot of documentation. And therefore, documents retrieved from there formed a great deal of the evidence that we had, even though a lot of that documentation was lost because the value of it wasn't known at the time. There were stories of people using paper because there was nothing in the country. So as in the early 1980s, people selling things on the streets around S21 wrapped in paper that was confessions or original documents from S21 as just a source of paper. So I want to talk about some of the documents that we were able to use that show the policies and the connection between the people that we were putting on trial and this prison site. This is a list in the Khmer script. It's a little bit grainy because the photocopy is bad, but of prisoners at S21. With a translation there. Doik is the alias of an individual named Kangyuk Ev. He was the first person put on trial at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, the head of the S21 prison center. And you're going to see this through a series of documents that I'm going to show you. But the fact that we have this prison list, he's referring to Uncle Peng. It's not actually his uncle. Uncle is an honorific in Khmer for someone who is just a little bit older than you. But here you're seeing the command structure of S21, where the head of S21 is receiving a report on the number of prisoners and reporting back that they should all be killed. Here is another prisoner list from S21. You can see here the euphemism smashed. This was often a term that was used to refer to killing, and that was something that we had a lot of debates about what the word smashed meant exactly, but it ultimately was found that it was a term for killing. Here you have, on one day, the killing of 256 people. Typically, these individuals would be brought out of Phnom Penh to an area currently called the Killing Fields, right outside of Phnom Penh. It is also a site of conscience. If you have an opportunity to go to Phnom Penh, it's another place right outside of Phnom Penh that you can visit, and you can see the mass graves there. Here's another prisoner list with instructions regarding who should be kept and who should be smashed. I should also mention that all of these, the names in here were also very helpful. Usually they would give a name, they would give a rank, or where they were captured from. This allowed us to trace back individuals for about where they were coming from, who was in charge of them, where they were being purged from. And it creates a picture when you go, there are hundreds and hundreds of these lists, and it creates a picture of which areas of Cambodia were being targeted and for what reasons over time. You see that in the translation over there, Kamrad Doik, again, the head of the S21 prison, proposed to Angkar. Angkar agreed. This is another example of linkage evidence. This is the head of the S21 prison asking for permission to kill people from the center. Angkar in Khmer means the organization. It was used as a way of instilling fear on the communities of democratic Kampuchea, because it was sort of this amorphous entity. They like to refer to them, there was a saying that Angkar has as many eyes as the pineapple. It sees everything that you do. The other reason is that the Khmer Rouge were incredibly concerned about secrecy. And therefore, referring to things as Angkar meant that they didn't have to identify any particular individual or say who was at the head of this organization. This is an example of a biography. The Khmer Rouge, this biography was taken as you were entering, as prisoners would enter the S21 prison center. They would be made to write a biography so that the S21 prison center would know about their background. Often, these would also be made at other prisons. The S21 prison center in Phnom Penh was one of hundreds of security centers around the country. And it was only the most important prisoners that would be transferred to the center. Those that were thought to have a lot of information about trying to overthrow the revolution or being CIA agents. Often they would say they were CIA agents and KGB agents, things like that. So a biography would come with them. Just on the topic of biographies, even individuals who were not detained would often be asked to write biographies on multiple times as they were moved from workplace to workplace to find out what type of background they came from. Those with bad backgrounds, for example, if you worked for the previous regime, the Lon Nol regime that preceded the Khmer Rouge, if you were a teacher, if you were educated, would be targeted for mistreatment or death. Those who had a correct background, who were laborers in the fields, were thought to be, not a threat to the organization, and in fact were elevated. And so they would ask them to write their biographies multiple times, often checking them against one another to see if there was any discrepancies, to try to root out these people they saw as enemies of the revolution. So this is a photocopy of that picture. Again, talking about the importance of linkage evidence. You see here, arrested from external commerce. External commerce is a unit of the Khmer Rouge government. And it was a unit overseen by the guy, Khieu Samphan, who we saw a picture of earlier, the economist who wrote the book. And so when his defense says, our guy didn't know anything about these arrests, wasn't involved with them, this is a piece of evidence that shows, well, people in your unit, in the portion of government that you oversee, were being arrested. And so that is extremely unlikely. That's another strange feature of the Khmer Rouge. Because of their extreme paranoia, many of the victims of the Khmer Rouge were themselves Khmer Rouge, particularly at S21, because individuals who were high-ranking Khmer Rouge members or even mid-level Khmer Rouge members were seen as particularly threatening to the organization, and so would be transferred to S21. You'll see in another slide, they were the idea that these are people that were burrowing from within the organization. Here we have a color copy of a confession page. When people were brought to S21, they were held in prison cells, which you'll see some of. They were interrogated. They were serially tortured over a number of weeks or months until they admitted to doing whatever the Khmer Rouge wanted them to admit to doing. They were asked to name who else was in their strings. That referred to who else was part of their group that was trying to overthrow the revolution. It was assumed that once you arrived, you were already guilty, and that you were part of a larger plot to overthrow the revolution. And so you had to confess to your guilt, and you had to confess that you were engaged in these actions with others. And often these confessions would be written over a long time of torture until they, quote unquote, got it right. Here you see that this is a cover page of a Democratic Kampuchea ambassador to Laos. Again, another example of a Khmer Rouge member who is himself a victim. Going back to the idea of linkage evidence, you see in the top left-hand corner annotation in Nguyen Chea's hand to Comrade Van. Nguyen Chea is the second in command to Pol Pot. He is the most senior member of the Khmer Rouge that we prosecuted. He just passed away this past August. We successfully, I should say, Doik, we also convicted of crimes against humanity. He's serving a life prison sentence. Nguyen Chea, also convicted of crimes against humanity, serving a life prison sentence, and also convicted at the trial level, and then he passed away of genocide and war crimes. And so here we have the liability of Nguyen Chea directly for S21. Nguyen Chea, in fact, was Doik's boss for a period of time. Doik reported to Nguyen Chea in regards to S21 because Nguyen Chea was in charge of the security of the nation. And if you're interrogating people who are ostensibly trying to overthrow the democratic Kampuchea, you have to get the information that they are admitting to, quote unquote, admitting to. So we have now Nguyen Chea in the communication cycle. It's almost like you have Nguyen Chea CC'd on an email in today's technology. To Comrade Van, Ieng Sary was also someone that we put on trial. Ieng Sary was the foreign minister of Democratic Kampuchea. One of the challenges of these cases is that because of ideas of secrecy, people had multiple names. They had their actual name, and then they had a revolutionary name, and then they often had a numerical denominator. So you might be Ieng Sary, who is also Van, who is also Brother 89. And that could be across thousands of people. So that requires a lot of research to figure out who all of those people are. Ieng Sary, we put him on trial along with Nguyen Chea. He unfortunately, as one of the repercussions of having these trials so late after the events occurred, passed away during trial, and that was the end of the case against him. And then in relation to our case, against Duch. There's also comments by him on the cover page of this confession. Here we have instructions regarding torture. Just an example of not only instructions regarding killing, but instructions regarding the various types of torture that they would apply. One of the things that we had to deal with at the court in terms of evidence was how to apply the evidence we had from S21 documents in the face of a treaty called the Convention Against Torture. The Convention Against Torture is a treaty that says that any evidence taken under torture cannot be used in a criminal trial against that person. The intentions are good. The intentions are that that it's supposed to dissuade countries from torturing people or individuals from torturing people, because they won't be able to then torture you till you confess and then use that confession to prove your guilt in court. The notations on these confessions do not constitute part of the torture-tainted evidence. And so those were okay to bring in, and we could use them for all sorts of reasons. Where it got difficult for us, the Convention Against Torture is supposed to protect individuals and help prosecute people who do torture, or help stop them from torturing. What got difficult for us was that in much valuable evidence was contained in confessions before they got to the parts where they said, I was inducted into the CIA when I was 15, and all this sort of made up stuff that they said. They would talk about where they were working. They would talk about who their commander was. They would talk about where they were stationed at various times. And this was valuable evidence direct evidence about how the Khmer Rouge worked. And so not being able to use that evidence was often worked against the ability to prosecute the people that were actually engaging in the torture. So it had a somewhat the effect was not what was intended, and it made it more difficult in our cases. This is just another example of a notation that we could use on a confession and an indication that the highest goal of these incarcerations and these torture sessions was confession. There was no question of gaining the truth. The individuals had to confess. The most senior level individuals who were then detained with their confessions were often taped, and they were broadcast to other people so that those other people also thought that they had actually engaged in counter-revolutionary measures. Pon was one of the deputies of Duch at S21. This just indicates the level of detail of the reports that were coming up regarding the torture of individuals. Some of you may have seen photographs that look like this. All of these photographs that you will have seen from the Khmer Rouge era were from the S21 prison. As far as we know, the only security center in Cambodia that took these types of photos was the S21 prison. It was one of the strange things about the Khmer Rouge. They were big on documentation. You can see here on this placard the date that the individual entered S21. You can see that she was entered with her child. These photos, in addition to being extremely haunting, give us an indication of the types of people that were being incarcerated. Sometimes we can match names with individuals. Sometimes, people in Cambodia can go to the court and look through all of these photographs and identify family members. But they can also help us understand that, for example, it was not just men, but also women being held there. We can see what people look like inside of S21. This is in one of the small cells of S21. You can see there's 2 people crammed in there with brick walls. This person is being photographed inside. This is one of the larger rooms, and you can see in the background everyone else that is also in this prison. Normally individuals, in the first 2 pictures that you saw, they were photographed on the way in. For whatever reason, sometimes individuals were also photographed once they were already placed in the cells. In the larger cells, if you were in the small cell, you had you were chained to the wall usually. Usually it was just 1 or 2 people. They're extremely tiny. The larger cells would have sometimes hundreds of people in them and they would run a pole down the middle of the room, and then everyone's ankles were then attached by chains to that pole to keep them there. And I have a photo of some of those rooms a little bit later on. They also show us other things about the content of the prisoners. On the left is an individual named Christopher DeLance. He's an American who was held at S21 and killed there. There is a number of foreigners that were captured by the S21, by the Khmer Rouge and brought to S21. The way this happened was that they would usually be sailing in the Gulf of Thailand, and either they would not realize that they were entering Khmer Rouge waters, or perhaps they didn't enter Khmer Rouge waters. We don't really know what happened. In one instance, we believe that there was a storm and a New Zealand sailor brought his ship to berth at an island out in the Gulf of Thailand. The Khmer Rouge captured him there. Once captured, they were brought to S21, tortured and killed. The confession of not this individual, but the individual from New Zealand whose brother actually testified in the case against Duch, the head of the S21 prison, had a number of interesting elements to it. For example, he gave as his confessed CIA number his home telephone number in New Zealand. He said that he was recruited into the CIA by Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame, and he also gave the name of his mother as a sort of a veiled response. Some people speculate that he sort of knew that he was going to die, and if this was the last document, he wanted to have a message to his mother that that he was thinking of her. Sorry, the person on the right-hand side, his name is Khoi Tun. He was a finance minister under Democratic Kampuchea. Ultimately was accused of subverting the revolution, as happened with so many people. And that's a picture of him being held in a private cell in S21. You can see that his ankles are chained. Another high-ranking Khmer Rouge official that was held at S21 was the zone secretary. So in the Khmer Rouge CPK hierarchy, you had the standing committee, which is a small committee at the top, the central committee, and then you had zones, which are kind of like states in America. The zone secretaries were the highest ranking Khmer Rouge person in the zone. The Northeast Zone Secretary was arrested, brought to S21, and we have his confessions. He's essentially incredulous that he's been arrested. He talks about how long he's been a member of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, and he essentially says what we all know about torture, whether it's whether it's under the Khmer Rouge or any place else in the world at any other time. He writes a letter to the Standing Committee and says, if you torture me, I'll say whatever it is you want me to say, but I am loyal to the revolution. Final slide here, again indicating from the pictures what we're able to tell. We were able to tell that children were held at S21 as well. Unlike the baby that was held by the mother in the previous photograph, this is clearly a child who has been arrested on her own and targeted. In terms of criminality, the torture of a child is not considered necessarily more criminal than the torture of an adult, but in terms of sentencing, the court is allowed to take into consideration that some of the victims were particularly vulnerable. And then finally on the right-hand side, that's a Vietnamese soldier who was captured and brought to S21. The Vietnamese soldiers were the main source of the war crimes charges. Cambodia and Vietnam had lots of skirmishes across the border. When they would capture Vietnamese soldiers, they would bring them to S21, often make videos of them because Vietnam was the primary enemy, and then torture and kill them. So the targeting of the Vietnamese, not so much the soldiers, but the population of Cambodia, that because Vietnam and Cambodia share a border, there was a lot of individuals that had lived in Cambodia for generations that might be somewhat ethnically Vietnamese or perceived to be ethnically Vietnamese. That constituted one of the genocide charges in the case that Nguyen Chea was convicted of, and Khieu Samphan. I just wanted to note, I talked about how S21 was only one of these security centers in Cambodia. There were a number of these other security centers. We don't have photographs from them, but this is an example of a different security center that we did have another interrogation report from. This is not a confession in the same way that it's not the individual's own words. This would be the interrogator describing what the individual said. And here you can see again the communication regarding what to do with the prisoners. So outside of just the S21, we also had other documents, original Khmer Rouge documents that we could rely on, that they are particularly weighty in evidence because they are from the time and often in the words of the Khmer Rouge. This is a cover of a magazine produced by the Khmer Rouge for internal consumption by Khmer Rouge cadre called Revolutionary Flag. A lot of it was propaganda, but it also contained it also gave good insight into sort of the thinking of the Khmer Rouge about what they wanted Khmer Rouge cadre to think and how they saw various groups. This is translation, obviously, of a portion of that revolutionary flag. I wanted to refer you particularly to this last paragraph here. I talked about the paranoia of the Khmer Rouge. You can see here them talking about the internal enemies and the need to, particularly the internal enemies, so that they lose the initiative and are unable to launch shock attacks on our party and revolution. And this was an example of their paranoia about people within the Khmer Rouge who are trying to destroy the revolution. You can also see here about strengthening the class struggle. They very much saw people of the prior upper classes, the wealthy, the educated, as inherently against the revolution, and people who were less wealthy, who were laborers, as the sort of base of the revolution. In fact, after the Khmer Rouge took over power in Cambodia, they pushed the people out into the countryside. The people that were already in the countryside were considered the base people of the revolution, and those that were pushed out were considered the new people. Here's another Revolutionary Flag magazine. This was going to the genocide of the Vietnamese. The Yuan is a derogatory term for Vietnamese in the Khmer language, and this goes very much to the mental element of trying to destroy or in whole or substantial part a group, which you need under the Genocide Convention. You can see here that they are saying before there were 1 million Vietnamese in the country, now there are none of them. This is also going to the linkage evidence. This is from the West Zone, so far away from the center. They're sending a report to the center, again talking about the screening of Yuan elements, CIA agents, and how they have killed them, and reporting this to the center, including the big adults and children. And again, reporting this to Ankara so that they know what's going on. It's important to show not only the control flowing down, but also the knowledge flowing up. This is a monthly report about killings happening in other places in the country. Another example of the knowledge flowing up to the center of the organization regarding the people that are being killed. This is a great one because it talks about the successive instructions from Ankara regarding killing, which is exactly what we had to show in order to bring the people at the center to justice. This one I included because it's one of the few documents we have dealing with the second group. I talked about the Vietnamese being one of the groups that that were convicted, that were targeted for genocide, and that we got convictions on. The second group is the Cham. The Cham is a Muslim minority that tended to live along the waterways. They were mostly fishermen, women. And here is a note talking about how they were instructed to disperse the Cham, to sort of break them up, and that also had a recipient list of individuals that were at the center of the organization. So that also helped us, just like with my email example before. You can see who it was that they were getting these instructions. I know we're running short of time, so I'll go through these a bit fast. But this is additional examples of people who are Vietnamese or other minority, the Jarai minority in the northeast hills of Cambodia, who were being targeted and who had information flowing to the center. Requesting more instructions, so it gives an idea of the detail, the level of almost micromanagement that was occurring. And again, the ability to show that people that we were prosecuting, such as Uncle Nuon or the office, which was headed by Q Sampan, were receiving these documents. We had minutes of meetings from the standing committee, and this one is. I mean, all of these minutes are interesting because they talk about the idea of the principles of getting rid of private property, of who are the enemies, the imperialist, feudalist, capitalist, and secondary capitalist, and also because they talk about this 3 tons per hectare plan. That was referring to the amount of rice that they wanted to produce on each hectare of land, and that was the unreasonable goal that they forced people towards, that were the charges for forced labor that led people to essentially be worked to death. And again, when you have standing committee meetings, it's great to know who was there. And because they were such meticulous note keepers, we're able to see that Pol Pot, who died before the Khmer Rouge Tribunal was set up, but also the 2 guys that we were prosecuting, were at these meetings where decisions were being made about forced labor. I'll skip that because we're short of time. This one was particularly important because it addressed who was allowed to decide on killing. And it was the people around the center office who could decide who to smash inside and outside of the ranks, essentially people within the Khmer Rouge and outside of the Khmer Rouge. We had access to speeches, both, this was Nguyen Cheo who we put on trial, speeches he would give and that would be included in the revolutionary flags, and speeches that were picked up by something called the Foreign Broadcast Information Service. They would be broadcast around the country. American radios on the Thai border would be able to pick up the speeches, translate them, and distribute them to the government. And we were able to use things like this against the individuals to say that they knew about the working conditions and instructions. Finally, we were able to use photographs. Sometimes, as I mentioned, the Khmer Rouge would bring in people that they thought were sympathetic, often other media organizations from other communist countries who would be able to take pictures. This is a picture of a forced labor site building a dam so that they had enough water during the dry season to continue building rice and reach this 3-ton per hectare of rice paddy per hectare goal. Another picture of a forced labor site. This is one of the few pictures, this one and the next one, of a forced marriage ceremony. Here you see multiple partners being married at once. Here we have some of the people that we were putting on trial at a political indoctrination event in the center of Phnom Penh. So the old guy, when I talked about his book and his PhD in economics, that's what he looked like at the time, Sampan. That's Doik at the time of the Khmer Rouge at the S21 prison center, along with other S21 workers. And then we also have the physical site. So this is the S21 prison site that was a school that we had all those black and white photographs of. That's what it looks like roughly today. And you can see the different buildings that were for different types of prisoners. That was the internal area. So when we saw the prisoner who was sitting inside and you saw the brick walls on either side of them, he was in one of these cells. And then finally we have the mass graves. This is one of the mass graves outside of Phnom Penh. And in some of these places we were able to do Cambodians were able to do forensics examinations, primarily to figure out how most of these people were killed, which tended to be by blunt force trauma to the back of the head. So with my apologies for going on longer than I probably should have, thanks for listening to me, and if you have questions, I'm going to answer them. And I'll just mention that, as it says up here, if you're interested, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal is a hybrid court. So the tribunal itself is at that top site. This is the UN mission to that tribunal.
Saying if they didn't go along with the Khmer Rouge and do what they said, a lot of these leaders, that they'd be killed themselves, so it's not a crime then?
Yeah, so that's a common argument in a lot of war crime tribunals, that I was just following orders. But that can be taken into consideration in terms of if it's a necessity defense, but you have to essentially admit that you did the things first and then say, but I didn't have any choice and there was no real option. The people that we were putting on trial, in the case of Doik, the head of S21, he actually confessed, and he didn't claim that it was because he had to do it for his own safety. He just was like, this was, I was part of the Khmer Rouge and I apologize. And in case of the other two guys that we put on a trial, they just said that they hadn't done anything wrong.
Can you explain what being party to the case means, and if is that a benefit for the victim?
Yeah, so so the parties to the case usually are the defense and the prosecution. That's just the words that are used in the law. And then for the civil parties, they get to apply to become parties. There are the benefits that so for example, they could be, if an individual in the case is found guilty, they're entitled to get certain benefits from the court. They're not allowed to get money under the rules of the court, but the court will do things like set up training programs or psychological assistant programs or monuments. And so it's, at least in the Khmer Rouge, it's more sort of symbolic. The International Criminal Court also has a scheme whereby victims can, to some degree, become parties to a case and get what they call reparations if an individual is found guilty in those cases. But mainly what it gives them, beside reparations, is the ability to sort of interact in the case. For some of them, that means testifying in court to be able to sort of address what happened to them. What's also interesting about civil parties, I mentioned how they don't have to swear an oath, but civil parties, unlike witnesses, once they have given their testimony, are also allowed a short amount of time to make an impact statement, where they can essentially say like whatever they want about how they feel about the people on trial, how this has affected their lives, and that's often the most emotional part of the case, because everyone just has to sit there and hear what happened to these people. And particularly, you know, I think it's good that the people that perpetrated these crimes have to sit there and hear them. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thanks. In terms of memorialization at the S21 Center, what are some ways that, I don't know, victims or just members of like Cambodian society in general pay homage to people that went through these acts?
Yeah, so it's there is a formal day of mourning every year. There are also some monuments. As a result of the tribunal, there have been educational programs instituted in schools, so they've created textbooks so that it becomes part of the education of school kids growing up, because there's not a lot of knowledge about the Khmer Rouge in some sectors. It's complicated also, however, by the fact that there were a lot of people that were Khmer Rouge that are still around in society, including the current prime minister, who was a member of the Khmer Rouge until he fled to Vietnam because he realized that he was probably going to be called to Phnom Penh soon and not be coming back. And so that creates an interesting dynamic in the society and in the court cases, because there is an interest on the UN side to prosecute additional people at these at the court, lower level people, and the government is saying, nah, we think we've done enough. We don't want to get too close for comfort.
Yeah, why don't you guys prosecute him?
Yes, sir. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, like, are you, as a persecutor, given like cultural competency training before this? Like, how is this? How are you consciously doing this without like reconstructing colonial relations, especially in post-colonial situation?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So I wasn't given any training. One of the benefits of having a hybrid tribunal, though, is that the hybrid nature of it means that there are both Cambodians and international in every office. So there are the judges that are sitting in judgment, both Cambodian and international. There are actually more Cambodian judges than international. The prosecutors, there are co-prosecutors, so a Cambodian and an international, that have equal amounts of power. And whenever I was questioning a witness, I would always do so in conjunction with a Cambodian partner. So that doesn't completely insulate me from potentially straying into that sort of things, but it made me more comfortable to know that it wasn't just, you know, the foreigners coming in and sitting in judgment of Cambodians. Yeah.
you must have more than 1,000 exhibits that you can show for evidence. What's the strategy for putting something like book on trial? Are you using narrative? What's the game plan if you want to get something?
Right. So, in terms of potential defendants, you mean? So Doik, because S21 was so notorious, was sort of a target from early on. He became, because then once he was found and detained, indicated an interest in being forthcoming, he became, it's part of the reason his trial was done first, because it produced so much information. And it also was kind of a trial run for the court, because the court was just getting set up. And it's much easier to do a case against a single individual, lower level, who's willing to admit to a lot of stuff as you work out the kinks of the court and the case and the procedures. And then we moved on to a case against 4 very high-ranking individuals with hundreds of crime sites across the entire nation. Yeah.
How did you prioritize, or I guess the trial prioritize civil parties? Because I imagine there were tons of individuals who wanted to be civil party and have their story be heard. So
Yeah.
how was that kind of handled, or
Yeah.
who got to choose who got to be a civil party and have their story be heard?
Right. So, so what happened was at the investigatory stage, actually, a lot of the civil parties were found by nonprofit organizations. They knew that there's this procedure, and they would go out to the community and say, listen, you can sign up as a civil party, and they would help them sign up. And that happened not only in Cambodia, but also in places where there are large diaspora communities of Cambodians. That includes Long Beach, California, right outside of Boston, Seattle, and also in France. So they would help these people sign up to be civil parties. If they were accepted as civil parties, which most of them were, they would become often represented by attorneys from those nonprofits that had helped sign them up. But ultimately, in order to have them represented in court, the court appointed lead civil party attorneys. And these were the people that sort of rode herd over all of the other attorneys that represented, maybe 10 or 20 civil parties each. And they had to represent a broad expanse of different civil parties. And it was negotiations between those individuals about who would testify. Some civil parties had no interest in testifying, and some very much wanted to. And then it was also a question about which had the best evidence for that particular crime section, and were most credible. Those sorts of questions. And because it's a civil party system, unlike in the U.S. Or a common law system, we didn't get to, as the prosecution or the defense or the civil parties, we didn't get to say, these are the witnesses we're going to put on. We had to make our list of who we would wanted to put on, give that to the trial chamber, the judges, and they would say, you get to call this person, you don't get to call this person. Because it goes back to this idea that the judges are the truth finders, and so they know better who to call. Yeah.
You mentioned with the Khmer Rouge and showed in the documents that there was control coming down and then knowledge coming back up.
Yes.
But also mentioned that some of the Khmer Rouge became prisoners themselves because if they knew too much and became a threat. So I was wondering, if you knew what the line was there, is it values?
Yeah, it wasn't so much that they knew too much. It was more things like, for example, one of the areas that was very, very heavily purged was the East Zone, which was along the border with Vietnam. Vietnam would routinely attack into Cambodia after Cambodia attacked them. And if they were able to attack very far into Cambodia, the center, Khmer Rouge, Nguyen Chea, and them would say, well, we're so much more powerful than Vietnam. The only way that Vietnam could have been so successful in that attack is if the people that are fighting against them are actually in cahoots with them. And so they must be actually internal enemies burrowing from within, and therefore we're going to bring them over and arrest them. I should go back over here and then I'll come back. Yes, ma'am.
Could you describe the process of how the International Legal Council is like picked out basically for this case? Like, how is it decided who's going to be a prosecutor?
Sure. So at the very top level, for like my boss about who's going to be the international prosecutor, that is somewhat political. I mean, there's a small group of people that would be have the experience to fill those jobs, and so that's done in a slightly different way. But for my job, the UN has a job site. It's called Inspira. And you can find jobs for all sorts of UN jobs all over the world doing all sorts of different things, some legal, some not, on that job site. And it's just an application process. The UN is a huge bureaucracy, so it's incredibly aggravating. You may not hear anything back on your job application for a year, and then they'll be like, we'd like to interview you. But that's just the way it works. So if any of you are interested in international jobs in pretty much any field, the UN probably has a job doing that somewhere, so you should check it out. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is here that what is the International Criminal Court security or protection plan, protection measurement for the witness or the victims that who ask for prosecuting some high-level individual or group that who are in the power?
Right. So, witness protection in any case is very important. There's attempts at secrecy to the extent that that is possible. It often is not possible. When you are rolling into a Cambodian village in a couple of huge Land Rovers, and you go and sit in a hut with someone afterwards and ask them a bunch of questions, even if no one else is around. When you leave, you better believe that the whole village is going to want to hear what you guys were talking about, and they may not be able to say, "Oh, the weather." But in terms of the International Criminal Court, what they often will do is, if they really feel like the witnesses are in danger, they will bring their families with them and relocate them either to the Netherlands or to other willing countries if they think that once they've given their testimony, it's not safe for them to return back to that whatever country it is. It's over. Yeah. Hey.
So my class was on civil society organizations and NGOs. So could you talk a little bit about the role of that document center of Cambodia or any Cambodia-based NGOs that collaborated with you?
Yeah. So DC Cam is by far the one that we worked with the most, and they were essentially. I mean, they do a lot of things now, including. As we were talking about a little bit earlier today, they're doing an oral history project about the court where they're interviewing people and making videos about the court. But they are essentially before there was the idea or the possibility of a court, they were just it was sort of a memory institutional. They wanted to talk to as many people as possible to get a story about what occurred during the Khmer Rouge. And then the court, the setting up of the court sort of accelerated that process. And then there are local NGOs that we worked with to sort of get, that were focused on other things. So for example, that report about forced marriage, they're focused more on those types of crimes. And so we would work with them to get, or the investigative office to get access to witnesses that they thought were particularly important. Yes, yeah. Max.
So, a couple of questions about the documentary evidence that you're describing. So first, this is a factual question about securing continuity of chain of evidence. So we're talking about boxes and boxes or stacks and stacks of paper. And the question I had was, where was all that stuff between 1979 and the starting up of the ECCC? I mean, and depending on how you answer that, wasn't that bad? I mean, like, who had it? Where was it? How'd you get it?
Yeah. So in many things about evidence are more lax in the international context than they are in domestic contexts. And proponents of international crimes will say that's a necessity. If you try to apply domestic evidence requirements, you will never be able to convict anyone. Chain of custody is one of those issues. Particularly in atrocity crime situation, it can often be difficult, particularly when you're not doing it at the time. You don't have a court in vision. It can be difficult to be like, oh, this document was here, it was there, it was there. Many of these documents were actually secured at first by the Vietnamese, who had propaganda reasons for themselves highlighting places like S21 and doing show trials, because it made their invasion, which was not based on humanitarian reasons, but made their invasion seem more proper, because they could say, we invaded and look how terrible these people were, the world community should embrace us. At the time, there was all sorts of Cold War tensions where America was in favor of the Khmer Rouge because it was not Vietnam and the Russians. So many of those documents were held first by the Vietnamese, then transferred to the puppet government that was set up by them. And there were some debates about, were some of these documents manufactured by the Vietnamese in order to, and we had to have debates about that in court. There was like, some documents that was sort of, they didn't have any of the markings that seemed to make them Khmer Rouge, and we weren't able to use them because issues like whether they were real or not were difficult to figure out.
Just a quick follow-up, and to refer to something that you and I were talking about earlier. Can you talk a little bit about this fascinating trend that you were describing, where of trying to secure documentary evidence for future courts that don't yet exist and may never, right? I thought that was a very interesting point.
Yeah, so there's been a process of investigatory mechanisms being set up even in the absence of a possible court. And to go back to the ideas of chains of custody, they are being very careful about places like Syria. Both the UN has set up an investigative mechanism regarding Syria to put together case files and figure out who should be prosecuted if there are ever such a possibility to do so. And the UN, as well as private nonprofits, have been collecting evidence from within Syria. They have networks of people helping them at great risk to their own lives smuggle documents out of Syria. They're talking to witnesses that leave Syria that might know about how these places are working. They are documenting how these documents arrived at them. So in the future, if there's ever a possibility for cases, they will be able to say, this is the chain of custody of this document. And another interesting thing about evidence, in the Khmer Rouge period, we actually had some videos that were propaganda videos. But as technology changes, what's interesting is you're finding situations where evidence of crimes is being voluntarily put on social media sites by the criminals or those around them themselves. So there will be someone will upload to Facebook, someone who's in ISIS, say, will upload to Facebook a video of a beheading or a shooting. That becomes evidence, but it brings with it all sorts of other challenges. So I was talking to the man who is in charge of evidence, the evidence sort of collection and control process at the Syria mechanism, or processing there. And they have to think about how they can organize all this evidence so that it's quickly retrievable and taggable, and that it's around in a format that can be read 20 years from now if they have the opportunity to prosecute someone. They also have to deal with the fact that many of these social media sites are also trying to take down these types of things for good reasons. They're well-intentioned. They are getting it from both sides sometimes because governments are saying, you, YouTube, need to take down videos of people being beheaded, and these investigative mechanisms are saying, you, YouTube, don't destroy evidence that we might want for our cases. And so they have to work with these organizations to try to find a way to satisfy both.
Maybe 2 more questions from students.
Okay, yeah. Ma'am?
How does the translation process work in like an international case of this magnitude? So in the court, you said that it was split between the judges and the prosecutors, but as far as documents go and your location when all of this is going over such a long period of time, how does that work?
So there are translators on staff. We worked at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. We worked in 3 languages: French, English, and Khmer. So there are translators on staff translating all of the documents into all 3 languages because there are people that were working in all 3 languages. When we filed documents, we had to file in Khmer and at least one other language, either English or French. We also had simultaneous interpretation. So when we're in court, most of our witnesses, of course, are speaking in Khmer. I'm speaking in English because I don't speak Khmer. And so I'm speaking very slowly so that, and we're all wearing headphones. That's why if you ever see any of these international courts, everyone's wearing headphones. Because while I'm talking, my words are being interpreted into Khmer, and then the individual will start talking in Khmer, and I will eventually hear it interpreted back to me in English. Fun little side note, I don't know if you guys are aware of this movie on Netflix made by Angelina Jolie called First They Killed My Father. It's about the Khmer Rouge. The guy who plays the father in that film was one of the interpreters at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Yes, ma'am.
So kind of going off of Professor Leonard's question, earlier you mentioned the civil society reports that ended up being very helpful in the trial, but I'm wondering what role these reports played in society prior to the trial, and if they had any role in, giving some sense of justice in the meantime before the trials. In other words, like what did these sorts of reports mean to people?
Yeah, so I'm not aware that these types of reports were being made before the trial. The trial started, the court started investigating in the early 2000s, but they definitely have a role to play outside. We are, I spoke about this a bit in Carrie's class about the role of these courts in terms of telling the stories. These courts only tell a slice of the story, and these cases do not address all of the impacts that, for example, gendered or sexual violence had during the Khmer Rouge period, particularly if for some other reason they just, we didn't deal with every crime site. We couldn't. There was just too many of them. We didn't deal with every type of victimization. And so there are definitely people whose story is not represented in the ultimate judgment or in the trial. And those can be explored not only in a more full way, but in an unfiltered way. They can just tell their story as they perceive it, whether some judges find that there is factual evidence to back that up or not. So I think that they play a valuable and different role.
So, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.